God's children are just as necessary to Him in the carrying out of His perfect plan as any plant, flower, or tree is, and is necessary for them to cooperate in the perfect way which He sees. It was the withdrawal of man from this perfect plan to cooperation that threw the world out of balance and caused great waves to sweep over and destroy the greater portion of His children. It is the perfect thought of love cooperating with poise and power in the hearts of God's children that holds the earth in balance. When they dissipated that force in thoughts of sin and lust, it swung so far out of balance that the great waves rushed over and nearly annihilated man and the work he had accomplished. At that time, man had accomplished far more than he has today. But God cannot control man's thoughts of love and balance, or hate and unbalance. They are for man to control. When the thought force that threw the earth out of balance was dissipated by the great cataclysm it had brought on, then God in His mighty power could restore the earth to its proper equilibrium or balance. But as long as man's thoughts held sway, God was powerless to act. Here Bagot Aran ceased speaking and took his seat. We had noticed that our host, the governor, had betrayed signs of uneasiness and considerable excitement, and when Bagot Aran took his seat, our host's excitement burst forth in an exclamation which carried the meaning of, "Dog, dog of a Christian, you have defamed the name of our fair Buddha, and you shall suffer." At this, he pulled a cord that hung from the ceiling near him. Instantly 3 doors flew open at the opposite end of the room from where he was sitting, and in rushed 30 soldiers with drawn swords. He had risen from his seat at the table, and the 2 guards who had accompanied him and were standing just back of his chair during the meal stepped forward to his side. Raising his hand, he gave an order. 10 of the soldiers came forward and arranged themselves along the back of where Bagot was sitting. 2 stepped forward and took their stand just back of and on each side of his chair. The commander walked forward and stood at attention a short distance from where the governor and his 2 guards stood. Not a word had been spoken by any of the company, and scarcely a move had been made. We sat completely overcome by the suddenness of the change. Then a deep silence seemed to fall, and a strong light blazed forth in the room at the head of the table, just in front of where the governor stood. Every eye was upon his face as he stood, with upraised hand, as though about to give another order. But his face was ashen pale, and a look of horror had come over it. A dim form seemed to be standing on the table before him. He heard the word, "Stop," pronounced clearly and very forcefully, and the word itself stood out in flaming letters between the dim form and the governor. The governor seemed to understand, for he stood as though transfixed and as rigid as a statue. By this time the dim form had taken shape, and we recognized it as that of Jesus, as we had seen him before. But the thing that amazed us was that another dim form was standing beside him. It was this form that was holding the attention of the governor and all the soldiers. They seemed to recognize and to fear the dim form that stood by the side of Jesus far more than they did Jesus. As we looked around, they were standing perfectly rigid. As the second form grew more distinct, it raised its right hand as Jesus had done, and at this every sword fell from the soldiers' hands, clattering to the floor. The room re-echoed with the sound, so deep was the stillness. The light seemed to glow with a far greater intensity. Indeed, so intense did the light become that we could scarcely see. The commander was the first to recover. He stretched forth his hands, exclaiming, "Buddha, our Buddha, the Sublime One." Then the governor exclaimed, "It is indeed the Sublime One," and threw himself prostrate on the floor. The 2 guards stepped forward and assisted him to his feet, then stood silent and immovable as statues. A shout went up from the soldiers, who had arranged themselves at the far end of the room. They rushed pell-mell along each side of the table and crowded together at the head, shouting, "The Sublime One has come to destroy the dogs of Christians and their leader." At this, Buddha stepped back upon the table until he could look them all in the face, and raised his hand with the words, "It is not once that I say stop, not twice that I say stop, but 3 times that I say stop." Each time when he pronounced the word, it appeared in flaming letters as it had when Jesus had pronounced it, and the words did not disappear, they remained. The crowd of soldiers again stood and stared as though transfixed, some with their hands in the air, some with 1 foot from the floor, in the attitude in which they happened to be at the instant Buddha had raised his hand. He again walked to where Jesus stood, and placing his left hand under Jesus' raised arm, he said, "In this, as in all things, I support the upraised hand of my dear brother here." Then he placed his right hand upon Jesus' shoulder, and they stood in this attitude for a moment. Then both stepped lightly from the table, while governor, commander, guards, and soldiers fell back, staring at them with blank, ashen faces. The governor sank into his chair that had been moved back until it was against the wall of the room, and every one of the company gave vent to a sigh of relief. I think scarcely one of us had drawn a full breath during the few minutes it took to enact this scene. Then Buddha locked his arm in that of Jesus, and the two walked directly in front of the governor. In words that were thrown from him with such force that they seemed to rebound from the walls, Buddha said, "Dare you for 1 moment call these, our dear brothers, Christian dogs? You, who but a short time since ruthlessly cast aside a little child who was pleading for help for a loved one. This dear great soul here turned aside and heeded the call." Here he dropped Jesus' arm, turned, and with hand extended toward Emal's mother, stepped toward her. As he continued, he turned halfway around so that he could look from the governor to Emal's mother. It was plainly seen that he was deeply stirred. He fairly flung the words from him as, looking at the governor, he continued, "You, who should have been the first to respond to the call of that dear child, shirked your duty, and then you call the one that did respond a Christian dog. Go and see the restored child whose body but a moment before was torn and writhing in anguish. See the comfortable home that has been reared from the hovel that your acts are partially responsible for thrusting upon these dear ones. See the miserable heap of filth and rags that this dear soul," turning to Emal, "raised that child's body from. See how tenderly he raised him and placed him in a clean, neat couch. Then see how, after he had raised the little body, the filth and rags disappeared. And you, lascivious bigot that you are, were sitting at ease in the purple that is to be worn only by those that are pure. You dare to call these that have in no way harmed you or another Christian dogs, and you call yourself the follower of Buddha, the high priest of the temple here? Shame, shame, shame." It seemed that every word would hit the governor, the chair, and the draperies about him and rebound. At any rate, they were sent with such force that the governor trembled and the draperies fluttered as though they were blown by a strong wind. There was no question of an interpreter. The governor did not need one. He understood perfectly, although the words were spoken in the purest English. Buddha turned and walked to the 2 men who had received the gold pieces, and asked if he might have them. They handed the disc to him, and, with these in his open hand, he walked back to the governor and addressed himself directly to him, saying, "Put forth your hands." The governor did so, but they were trembling so greatly that he could scarcely hold them out. Buddha dropped a disc in each hand, and almost instantly it disappeared. Buddha said, "See, even pure gold will fly from your hands." And the 2 discs landed almost simultaneously on the table before the 2 men that had first received them. Buddha reached both hands, placed them on the governor's outstretched hands, and in a mild, calm voice said, "Brother, you need not fear. I do not judge you. You are only judging yourself." He held his hands thus and stood quietly until the governor became calm. Then he removed his hands and said, "You are quick to fly with your swords, to redress what you judge to be a wrong. But remember, when you